muted. No one can hear anything I'm saying. No, there we go. I unmuted in the browser thing we use. I unmuted my mic, didn't push the slider up. So technically I wasn't muted. I just didn't have any output going on. We'll try. I swear, you know, I've been doing this for nearly 7 years. You would think that by now I was able to start a live stream and not be muted somehow.
Now there's more mute buttons than ever before.
There's so many, so many. Anyway, we'll try that one again. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and I am joined by the wonderful E.L. Meszaros, who is going to talk to us about Mesopotamian astronomy, which I will confess I know very, very little about, despite having like a whole Assyriology background thing. Not a whole lot in the science area, so this is going to be really interesting. She has kindly agreed to take some audience questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat so that I can get to them. But before that, EL, hi, how are you doing?
I'm great. How are you, Megan?
Also pretty good. Audio issues aside.
It's lovely to be back on Digital Hammurabi. I feel like it's been a minute since I've been here on the channel.
It's been a while. So for people not familiar with EL, she did like an age ago a whole series with the lovely Dr. Sarah Moore called Assyriology Today, which was looking at all kinds of new stuff going on in the world of Assyriology. And then I believe the pandemic happened, and then I had twins and everything, and you had a baby, and everything is just like completely. Yeah, it's been a lot. I think everyone is like, everything has just been a lot the last few years.
Truly.
But it's lovely to have you back.
Thank you. It's
lovely to see you. Now, you are a PhD student at Brown University, and I have a whole little introduction that I probably should have read before we, started chatting. We're all a little bit backwards here today. That's fine. But your PhD is studying the history of the exact sciences in antiquity, which we will get to. I'm going to now mute my phone. Good God Almighty, it's going fantastic.
It's just informal. It's fine. Everyone's comfortable having tea.
I am very happy that our audience is not expecting formality or like any kind of polish. We've upgraded our camera game recently, so you can actually like see us a bit better. But I have to say, I can't do anything about the me side of things. So, but what you see is what you get, I'm afraid. Anyway, back to you. So exact sciences in antiquity. We're getting to that later because I don't know what that means. So I have a question about that, which is essentially, what is it?
Valid question.
Yeah, it's a great question. Now, your current research focuses on astronomy in the Near East and includes scientific metaphor in ancient Greece. Love a metaphor. Fantastic stuff. And you focus on the application of social science research methodology, including feminism, linguistics, and the field of science, technology, and society to ancient science. Amazing. Love that. Now, in addition to your academic work, you also work as a freelance writer. So if people are interested, EL's work can be found in various online magazines and blogs. There are some scholarly pieces with Eidolon and Lady Science, and creative nonfiction pieces with the VRV blog. And she's also contributing editor with the Journal of History of Ideas blog, co-founder of the RATI, and managing editor of CAMWS Graduate Student Issues Committee blog. So I put links to all of that in the show notes if anybody is interested. I've also got EL's Instagram page. Fantastic cat pictures there. Highly recommended. Beautiful. And also EL's website, so you can go and have a look around there and see what is going on. Now, questions, because I have many. I'm sure the audience has many.
Bring them.
So how did you first become interested in the study of the ancient world?
So my study of the ancient world was sort of late in my high school career. At my high school, they made you take a language. Like you had to take a year of a language to graduate. It was it. And I didn't come in with a lot of language experience. So I took French my sophomore and junior year because my good friends were taking French. And high school is, after all, a very social setting. But it was fine. It's a good language. Lovely people speak French. But it didn't hold my attention. And I kept seeing people translating Latin on sort of the outskirts of my friends' groups. And I was like, well, that's novel and interesting. That's a language people aren't speaking, but there are some things written in it. I wonder if that would maybe appeal a little more to my mathematical mind. So my senior year of high school, I took Latin and I fell in love with the language. sort of specifically the language. There's a lot of mythology taught in like a high school Latin course, and that was cool. But I was here for like the mathematical introduction to how sentence structure works in a Ciceronian way. And that was my introduction, I think, to the ancient world. So by the time I got into undergrad, I declared myself as a classical studies major, I think in my first year, within the first couple months. And I just dove headfirst into everything that my small liberal arts college could offer.
Perfect. Now, if you're getting into Latin because of the whole like mathematical, grammatical side of things, I'm assuming we have quite a strong interest in math generally, and from your current research, also in science. So did you, once you declared your major, did you kind of keep gravitating in that direction?
That's a great question. And that is sort of the trajectory of my entire like graduate studies career. So
it's like science, but make it older.
Yeah, yes. And that's how I'm here today. So yeah, I loved science. I still love science. But like as a kid, I loved sciencey things. I was really into paleoanthropology as a precocious middle schooler. I loved the skeleton called Lucy. I was very into that. So I loved science. And in high school, I did like all the AP science classes, and I competed in like science fairs, and I did these things. And so it was a real turnabout for my family when I got interested in ancient studies and classics. They were like, this doesn't quite track. And then the rest of my life career has all been about those two interests being at odds with each other. So I was born in the 80s. I grew up in the 90s. This was sort of the era where history of science was becoming more popular, but it certainly wasn't something that they taught in like tiny liberal arts schools or in high schools. So I didn't have any idea that there was a field out there that combined things like ancient studies and science together. I thought everything had to be separate in like a snow two cultures sense. So I kept bouncing back and forth between science and mathematics and humanities, and specifically classics and ancient studies. And I just always felt like I was missing something until I found history of science. And I realized, oh, I can study scientific texts in ancient languages. I can study scientific concepts that are from cultures that are so different from mine that their ideas of what science and even nature are vastly different. And that's how I got to where I am today.
That's fantastic. Now, for people who are not familiar, like me, for example, what is the history of the exact sciences?
That's a great question. I feel like the name of my department is so like you have to push your glasses up your nose when you're saying it. History of the exact sciences and antiquity. So by exact sciences, we mean specifically astronomy, mathematics, optics, physics, things that aren't like the life and natural sciences. So no biology, no medicine, things like that. And this is a field that is sort of, you can trace its beginning back to one guy, sort of mid and post World War II, Otto Neugebauer, and his journey from Germany into America, and actually to Brown University, where I'm studying. So Brown is sort of the foundational place for this study of the history of the exact sciences. And it's worth talking a little bit about the ancient world that's in that title too, because a lot of historians of science will assume that anything before the early modern era doesn't even get to count as science. They'll call it natural philosophy. They'll say science doesn't happen until the 16th century, and anything before that is somehow less than science. But my field specifically says that dichotomy is wrong. Science doesn't have to look like what you think science looks like to be science, and we can find that in the ancient world. So history of the exact sciences in the ancient world is all about finding things like astronomy in cultures that traditionally get written off as not even having science.
So if we're thinking about Mesopotamian astronomy, what parallels can be drawn between what we would consider modern scientific inquiry? How does it fit into what I think most people would understand as being science?
It's a great question. There are some direct parallels, and some parallels that feel direct once you get to know them a little bit better, but are at first a little off. Sorry, let me laugh a lot at the sparkling observation comment in the chat. Choice, well done. So there are a lot of, especially in the first millennium, in the later first millennium BCE, we get a lot of really advanced and complex predictive schemes for the movement of the planets and the moon throughout the sky. And these, I think, parallel predictive schemes that we see throughout the rest of antiquity into the medieval period. And in fact, many of them are used to formulate like Ptolemaic astronomy, which becomes medieval astronomy through the Arab world. So there is like a direct lineage of techniques for predicting the movement of the planets from Babylonian astronomers. But I think when you get down to the basics of it, we can also trace to Babylonian astronomers the idea of like the invention of the zodiac, the idea that these named constellations that are in the path that the moon and sun and planets all appear to take through the sky, the reason those are named and codified into 30-degree increments is because of the Babylonians. And even though we associate now the zodiac with astrology and something that is very to the side of science, to the Babylonian astronomers, this was a mathematical like coordinate system that they needed for their predictive schemes, and it very much formed the backbone of something that looks similar to the science that we would talk about today. Now, it was also used for astrology. Those two ideas, astrology and astronomy, not so separated in Mesopotamia, but
So just quickly, what would the distinction be in modern understanding between astronomy and astrology, and how do those two things get interwoven in Mesopotamia?
yeah, okay. So astronomy in a modern context is the study of like the science behind the stars and space and the heavens. And astrology is their influence on human life. So this idea that the placement of the planets among the stars, the placement of the constellations in the sky have some sort of influence on the choices we make or the events that happen to us. In most of antiquity, those two aren't separated at all. And the idea that you would want to predict where a planet will be because its position will have an impact on you, the king of Babylon, or your country, it's why you're carrying out the scientific research in the first place. So there's a lot of recent push maybe in the field to sort of combine the two terms. You'll get people who talk about astral sciences as a way of combining astronomy and astrology in this ancient context. And then there are people who come up with silly terms like astrolonamagy, which is just a combo of them. Fun to say, but
Fun to say, but I think I would, if I was lecturing, I would trip over that
yeah, yes, it's a tongue twister.
A lot. So if you're looking at the impact that the movements of the planets, stars have on the Earth and your kingdom, do you get like personal horoscopes that we might, like along the lines of what people might understand them to be today? Are they restricted just to like the king and the country as a whole entity, or do you get your average person going and getting their horoscope to find out what's going on for them?
That's such a good question from such an informed Assyriologist, I can tell. So we do get personal horoscopes, but this happens very late in Mesopotamian history. We don't get it until the very end of the first millennium BCE, after the period where we're getting a lot of influence with Greece. And in Greek texts, we see tons of personal horoscopes. So there's some circulation of not just knowledge, but astronomical practice that sort of brings into Babylonia this idea that personal horoscopes could be fun or more likely lucrative. Prior to this period, we get very impersonal horoscopes, generally just things that impact the king as an individual or more generally the country. And a lot of these will take the forms of omens. So you can say if there is an eclipse, then this land is in danger. If the sun rises red in the constellation Scorpio, then this land will have a famine, things like that.
So what made you choose specifically out of all of the sciences in the ancient world that you could focus on? What made you choose astronomy?
I have always loved outer space. I feel like a lot of kids go through an outer space stage, like when they're 5 and they want to be an astronaut. And I just never grew out of that. So I've always been fascinated with outer space, and in particular, the US's involvement in getting humans to space. So I've done a lot of research work with a number of different NASA centers as well. I worked at JPL on ontological modeling on the back end of spacecraft modeling software. I worked at Langley in Virginia on human autonomous system teaming. I worked with the headquarters and Marshall Center on telling the history of NASA centers, because NASA has been around so long now, it has its own history center. And I loved working with people who are so interested in getting humanity into space, even if it's just human knowledge, autonomous systems up there. But I wanted to do more with some of the further away space artifacts, some of the planets we haven't visited, as autonomous systems. I guess it's just the moon that we've gone to as humans. Oh, I think you're still muted.
I am still muted. Goodness me. It's all going well today. I just want to remind people, if you have questions for EL, please pop them in the chat. We will get to those before we finish up. Is there anything about Mesopotamian astronomy that people might find surprising, or not shocking, but like just pause?
I mean, I feel like there's so many things about the science from this period that it would be interesting and that, like, ooh, jump sense. But maybe the thing I'll highlight here is something that often gives people pause in a negative sense, and that is this use of the sexagesimal system. So Babylonian astronomy is a very often mathematical astronomy, and it's written in a number system, in a cuneiform number system that isn't decimal like our system. It doesn't go 1 through 9 and then to the next digit over, 10 through 19. It does it in groups of 60s. So you get 1 through 59, and then you move the next digit over, do 1 through 59 again. And the sexagesimal system is, I think, something that scares a lot of people off. Doing math not in a decimal system. I mean, sometimes getting people to do math in general is scary. Getting people to do math not in a decimal system is even scarier. But the sexagesimal system was so important for astronomy that they encoded all of their like circle measurements in this base 60 system. It's why circles have 360 degrees, because that's a nice 60 divided number to work with. And it's all because the people who codified how many degrees there should be in a circle were working in a base 60 system. So I will say, don't be scared by the sexagesimal system, but it's weird, and it's cool to work with something that's weird. It feels very different from any of the other work that you'll do here.
Sorry, I just hit my mic. How did Mesopotamian astrologers think about or conceive of space? Obviously, they don't have the same understanding that we have. So what did they think it was?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the unfortunate parts about Mesopotamian astronomy is we don't have tons of texts that talk a lot about a cosmological idea of what the universe is. We have a creation story that tells us that the heavens are sort of the dismembered corpse of a god that was overthrown by Marduk, right? So we have this very vivid creation story that gives us what I would call a metaphorical understanding of what the universe is. As far as like a scientific understanding, we know that they recognize that there were fixed stars and there were things that moved that weren't fixed stars. That is the planets, the moon, the sun. But we don't have a lot of texts that talk about, were the fixed stars behind the moving planets? Are all of these spheres, or are they just moving things in the sky? Is the Earth moving versus is everything moving around the Earth? These are topics that the Greeks can't shut up about. This is what the Greeks want to talk about all the time. And they left us so many texts that talk about the philosophy of this. And we just don't have that from Mesopotamia. And it's hard to say whether that was not important to them, so they didn't write it down, or if that was something that was reserved for oral conversations, so it just never made it to the cuneiform tablets, and it was never then copied into later centuries and preserved for us today. So a lot of that is still up in the air, but we do have some like mythological understanding of how they viewed the universe. And that's something that if you want to take this class with me, we'll get to read a little bit of that and talk about the dismembering of Tiamat.
Who doesn't want to talk about that?
Yeah.
Really? And we will get to that in a second, but I have one more question.
Yeah, please.
And it is, what sources do we have from Mesopotamia for understanding astronomy and how everything worked and what people were doing?
Yeah, great question. So as with most other Assyriological fields, our primary sources for astronomy are these clay tablets. And there are just so many of these clay tablets. I heard that the British Museum has like hundreds of thousands of them. If you couple that with other museums around the world, including in Iran, there could be up to like 1 million recovered tablets, many of which are untranslated and we just don't know what they say yet. So we have a large number, I would say, of translated astronomical texts that we're working with. These are texts that are inscribed in cuneiform. So you take a reed, you push it into wet clay, you leave a mark behind, and you get a nice little handheld tablet that talks about some aspect of the world. These are things like observations of the night sky. These are sometimes letters reporting observations sent to the king. There's sometimes ominous interpretations or collections of potential ominous interpretations. Sometimes they're just calculated data, just nothing but like an Excel spreadsheet of columns and columns of data. And one of the cool things is that a lot of the tablets in the ancient world are fairly small. Like they're not big, but sort of uniquely in the astronomical world, we get these incredibly long tablets. I don't even think I can get centered on the screen, like huge tablets, because they had so many columns of data that they needed to calculate for predicting aspects of lunar theory. So most of what we're working with are texts. We have some things that aren't texts. There's a handful of illustrations that accompany these texts, but like literally a handful. If you think of the millions of tablets that are out there, there's maybe like 10 that have drawings on them. So this was not an important aspect of how they recorded their astronomy. And we do have some like carved stone images that go along, like friezes and things like this that include astronomical imagery as well. But predominantly what we're working with here is clay tablets.
Love a clay tablet.
Love a clay tablet.
Love them. And I know I said that was my last question, but actually as you were talking, I thought of another one. If you get a bad horoscope or a bad prediction, what do you just hang out and wait for it to happen? Can you do a ritual to avert it? What, like, move countries for a little bit? What's happening there?
It's such a good question. So it's going to depend on what the omen is and what stage in history. But generally speaking, the way that these omens work isn't causal. You don't like see the omen and then the bad event is destined to happen. There's no avoiding it. If you get the omen, you can take steps to avoid the bad event that's taking place. So one of the most famous examples of this is lunar eclipses in like the Neo-Assyrian period were often interpreted as being a sign that the king would die, the death of the king. This is bad. It's mostly bad for the king, but he's the only one whose records we have, and therefore the only one that we're really caring about here. So when scholars noticed a lunar eclipse or predicted a lunar eclipse, they would write to the king and say, hey, this spells your death. You need to do something to avoid it. And the Babylonians developed this substitute king procedure where they could take the king, remove him from office, still treat him nicely, still treat him to all the luxury he's accustomed to, and then raise someone else up in his stead as king, and then that king would be put to death to fulfill the omen, and the original king would come back in. It's sort of gnarly to think about now, especially if you think about the types of people who were lifted into that substitute king position. These are not volunteers who loved the king and country and religion so much that they wanted to die. These were often prisoners who were being sentenced to death. So it's a very gnarly ritual, but what an extravagant way to interpret the movement of the heavens and then to try to sidestep what that might mean on Earth.
It's yeah, not great to think about. Definitely not great if you are chosen as substitute kings, but
yeah,
pretty ingenious.
Yeah,
actually. Pretty ingenious. Now, as you mentioned earlier, and we had a little slide up before we started, you're going to be teaching for us a course on Mesopotamian astronomy. Very much introductory level stuff. Do people need to have an understanding of science or skies or really anything apart from the English language?
No, this is very introductory level. So if you've ever wanted to learn about ancient science, this is a perfect introduction. You don't need to understand anything about how the planets move, how our universe is arranged. You don't need to understand Akkadian or cuneiform. You don't need to understand history. All you need is an interest in any of these topics. And we'll walk through primary sources and translation. I'll give all the necessary background information to the scientific concepts that we deal with. And don't let the sexagesimal system scare you. We'll talk about it a little bit, but you won't have to do math if you don't want to do math.
I was going to say, the great thing is that you have the option for people to do activities, but if people don't want to make their own Babylonian horoscopes, they don't have to. Like, you're not going to be hunting them down and saying, you need to do the math and work all this stuff out, please.
Yeah, there's no email hunting on my end. But if you do love the sexagesimal system, if you see it for the glory that it really is, and you just like want to do some mathematical problems, I've got you covered too.
Perfect. So what kinds of topics are you covering? You've mentioned the Enuma Elish, which is the creation myth with the dismemberment going on.
Yeah, so I'm planning this as sort of a pretty linear discussion of how science sort of evolved over time in Mesopotamia. So we'll start with early astronomy. We'll start with creation myth. We'll start with some really early mathematical astronomy, because there was, even in the old Babylonian period, an idea of mathematical schemes for predicting things. And we'll start with omens. There's a lot of really juicy omens from the older period. And then we'll move into some of the later periods and see how through letters and reports, the people were actually dealing with these astronomical concepts. And once we move past that into the later first millennium, we'll get to talk about one of the largest scientific projects that's ever been documented in human history, which is the recording of the astronomical diaries, these records of nightly observations of the sky over a period of literally hundreds of years. And then we'll also get to talk about some of the really complex mathematical schemes that give accurate predictive power for the last half of the first millennium, and all the cool numerical tablets that they calculated with that.
And there are also, I've got everything set up on the course website, and there are, I've asked you to give a selection of museum objects that people can go and look at, and kind of, as they're going through your courses, have examples to actually help understand what exactly is going on when we talk about these objects. Do you have a favorite cuneiform tablet in this kind of astronomical area?
Okay. Oh, so I definitely have a favorite mathematical tablet, but let me say specifically for astronomical tablets, there is a procedure text that has 3 procedures for predicting the movement of the planet Venus. So it's a tiny little thing. There's not a lot of writing on it, but it's fairly complete, which is nice. We like it when a tablet's not super broken, so we get all the text there. And I love this tablet so much because it shows to me the way that the actual astronomical practitioners approached their understanding of science. One thing that happens is they use sort of variables up at the top where they'll say, okay, the fastest speed that Venus is going to move is 1¼ degree per day. The slowest speed it's going to move is 3/4 of a degree per day. Let's use that in our calculations. And then at the tail end of the tablet, way down at the bottom on the back, it says, oh, by the way, here are what those constants are. Here's the fastest speed. Here's the slowest speed. As if they were doing it as an afterthought at the end. There's a sense of like non-top-down linearity, which is something we're used to in a modern sense, right? All the algorithms we want to work with declare everything up at the top and then work down from there. And it just shows that the Mesopotamian astronomers weren't concerned with that. They didn't need to approach their tablets in this very linear sense. So I love this tiny Venus tablet because it feels very approachable, but it also suggests that this science is working in a way that is unlike the way we tend to approach science as people living in America in 2025.
I can't believe I forgot to ask this earlier, but astronomical tablets have been incredibly important for dating. Yeah. Like the whole of the ancient world. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have a fairly good understanding of like dating and chronology in the first millennium BC. In fact, because of these astronomical tablets, because we have intricate descriptions of how far Jupiter is from this star and how far Mars is from this other star. And we can tell how far away Mars would have been from our own calculations in the modern day. So we can pinpoint almost to the date things that are happening from like 750 BCE onward. Earlier than that, it gets a little dicier. And then like in the second millennium BC, there's all sorts of arguments about when dates are happening because we don't have the astronomical records to back it up. So chronology becomes like a big hot button topic in Assyriology until you get to the nice, consistent astronomical records of the first millennium.
See, if they'd all just kept astronomical diaries for the whole of, like, we'd know what was going on when. It would be perfect.
Just keep it up for a couple millennia. That's fine.
I don't see what the problem is there, honestly. It's so super easy.
Yeah.
So if this sounds interesting to you, if you would like to learn more about Mesopotamian astronomy, you can register. The course is available on our website. So you can go to digitalhammurabi.thrivecart.com/Mesopotamian-astronomy. I'm putting that in the description as well, because that is a bit of a mouthful. But you can register there. Class starts on February 18th at 6 p.m. and there are going to be 6 lectures. It's all going to be recorded as well. So if you sign up and you either can't attend any of them, or it's happened before you've signed up and you're kind of signing up after the fact, you get access to all of the class materials, all of the videos, all of like additional research information or reading suggestions. Everything is going to be available to you as long as I can keep it on the internet. So I don't want to say forever because I think no crystal ball, but a very, very, very long time. So probably as long as you need it. So absolutely take a look at that. If you have questions, you can email me, megan@digitalhammurabi.com, and I will get back to you and try and answer them. And we have audience questions because this is a fantastic, amazing topic. I'm not surprised there are audience questions. At least 2 people want to know what it feels like to be interviewed by your doppelganger.
Okay, so I didn't warn you that I had cut my hair, so this is sort of a surprise. I have a little 9-month-old baby who has reached the stage of grabby hands.
Oh, the grabbing.
The grabbing. So it felt prudent to remove some of the hair temptation. But otherwise, I'll just say that Megan's glasses are far superior to mine. Look at that cat eye shape. Look at the colors on that. I could only aspire to this.
I have a good line of very loud, obnoxious glasses. People either love them or despise them. There is no in between.
I'm solidly in the love camp, I'll say.
Thank you. I enjoy them. Well, obviously, I'm wearing them on my face, but I enjoy them. Now, Mark would like to know, and Mark has also already signed up for the course.
Oh, excellent.
We love Mark. He attends everything and has the fantastic questions that we are looking for. He would like to know, are there certain periods that are more or less fruitful in terms of artifacts or textual information? And do you study different regions and cultures as well, or are you sticking with Mesopotamia?
Yeah, these are great questions. So there are definitely eras that are more fruitful, and this is not likely just because we've only found sources from these disparate eras. There tends to be like a sort of like a dark ages of less textual evidence in the Babylonian period, in the Kassite reign period, right? So we tend to have some good old Babylonian texts, some great Neo-Babylonian texts, and then like in between there's a little gap. But you're right to point out that the archaeological evidence record is also a problem here. We are limited to studying only the things that have been uncovered. And for the longest time in like the 18th and 19th century, in the 19th century specifically, there's a big antiquities trade in these tablets. So much of what we have comes to us without provenance information. We don't know where it was found. And often we can date tablets that don't contain cool astronomical observations. We can date them from where they're found and like where they are in the stratigraphy, right? And also like what city and archaeological find spots they're found in. And without that information, it's hard to tell. So you're right to point out that that is a difficulty. And we will talk about some gaps in our understanding through the class, or gaps in our available material to feed our understanding.
The second part of his question was, do you stick with Mesopotamia or do you study other cultures and regions?
So I am currently active in a project that is looking at understanding the later astronomical procedure texts as algorithms, which is such a loaded modern concept. And one of the things I'm doing is seeing if an algorithmic form of these Babylonian procedures can help us understand how this knowledge circulated to other cultures. So I'm actively looking at specifically Sanskrit and Greek texts to see how this Mesopotamian astronomy moved around in this ancient world.
Oh, amazing.
And wait, I think I saw a question, or not a question, a comment from Mark earlier about using this material for RPGs. And I just want to say I'm fully on board with that. Love the idea of having a Mesopotamian situated TTRPG.
Yeah, it's perfect. He's been working on it for a while, and we get occasional questions over email. I'm like, I will do what I can to help.
Oh, that's amazing.
So Megan, not me, different Megan, asks, what did Mesopotamians see as the relationship between the heavenly bodies and the deities themselves? Were their deities in a literal sense, reflections or agents of the deities, or something else entirely?
This is such a good question. And unfortunately, it's just one of the things that they're not writing tons about. So we do get associations between, for example, the planets and deities. So something like Jupiter and Marduk, right? The very big, bright planet and the very big god of Babylonia. But we don't have texts that describe, hey, I think this is actually the god in the sky versus this is a metaphorical representation of the god in the sky. So we're trying to piece those ideas together from sort of like numerical mathematical representations. And this is difficult to do. So as far as we can say right now, there didn't seem to be an understanding of the planets as any sort of physical representation. Even though they talk about the heavens as a dismembered body of Tiamat, there doesn't seem to be a real understanding of the sky as like a fleshy god body. It does seem to be metaphorical, but our understanding of that could change as we uncover more tablets, if we uncover more writing and discussion of this idea.
Awesome, thank you. Bree wants to know, well, she says, I know the constellations we recognize today are from later periods, but are any of them from Mesopotamian astronomy, since appropriation is not new?
I am so glad you asked this question because appropriation is not new. And in fact, a number of our constellations today, even though we think of them as coming from the Greek world, they came to the Greek world from Babylonia. So a number of our constellations are Babylonian. Many of the zodiacal constellations are straight up Babylonian constellations. The crab, the scorpion, the scales, the fishes, the archer, all of these things are coming straight from Babylonia. There are some differences and there are some transitions. We'll talk a lot about Leo in the class because Leo becomes a lion in Mesopotamia, but doesn't start out that way. So we have Leo as a lion in our zodiac now. It was definitely a lion in the Greek zodiac, and it became a lion eventually in the Babylonian zodiac. There are some constellations that are unfamiliar, and unfortunately, they are just given the names of like deities or some guys. So we don't have a lot of understanding of maybe what they were supposed to represent in the sky. And in the absence of tons of pictures, we don't even necessarily know what stars they contained. So we have general ideas of what section of the sky they were in. And sometimes that's about it. We also have tons of individual star names too. While constellations were used as a metric to measure like the position of planets against, sometimes we needed something a little more granular. So we have tons of individual star names like the left paw of the lion or the front head of the fish or something like that. And those star names are vastly different from the star names we have now. A lot of our star names came from Arabic sources. But the Babylonian star names, I think, are at least fairly intuitive. They're all named based on the constellation that they come from.
I have a question based on all of that.
Yeah.
In cases where the constellations that we're familiar with seem to map onto Mesopotamian constellations, do we know whether they are the same stars, or is it we're not entirely sure, but they have the same name, so maybe?
That's a very good question. We think we have a pretty good idea of what stars the zodiacal constellations in specific contain because they're used so much for mapping. So we can tell, we know where Jupiter was supposed to be on January 1st of year 312 of the Seleucid era. So we know if it's supposed to be near the front star of the lion, then that star must map on to this particular star in the real night sky, and that goes with our constellation, the lion. So we have a fairly good understanding of that. It gets worse the further away from the zodiac you go. So the zodiac is this band in the sky that all the planets and sun and moon appear to go through. And as you go north of that toward the circumpolar constellations, the Big Dipper, the Little Dipper, or south of that toward the constellations that we don't see too much of here in Rhode Island, but you would down in Australia. Those constellations are a little less secure in our mapping. We're not as precise.
Thank you. The governor says, is there any indication that the 12 zodiac signs influenced deciding that there were 12 tribes of Israel?
Ooh, I have
outside, but
I have no knowledge on the tribes of Israel, so I can't help you there. But I can give you a little discussion of one of the reasons there are 12 zodiacal signs. Is because it's a nice divisor for 60, right? This worked well for their fractional system. So my guess is that there are 12 zodiacal signs specifically to make math easy. We'll find a lot of schemes in Mesopotamian astronomy that are designed specifically to make math easy as opposed to accurately represent the real world. And if that was some reason for there being 12 tribes as well, you could say that there's a mathematical equivalence there, but I don't know that there's any astronomical significance. I will say also that the zodiac gets codified around 450 BCE, which I don't know too much about the Hebrew Bible, but feels a little late for tribes of Israel.
Thank you. We have one final question from Mark. Oh no, two questions. Mark asks about the Venus text that you mentioned earlier. Is there any way to get a sense of the formality of the text? Is this someone's personal notation, or is it something that would have been disseminated and taught?
Yeah, great question. So we don't have a great understanding of how many of these tablets were used, but some of my research right now is indicating that they're sort of part of the process of education. So there is not a true informality or formality. There's a brusqueness to it, a lot of use of, since you've spent a lot of time here, a lot of use of Sumerian logograms in an era where Akkadian is being spoken. So a fallback to a lot of scientific language. But we get the sense that this is part of a copying assignment for an astronomer who's trying to collect Venus information all in one place, or who's trying to ensure he remembers the different schemes for the movement of Venus. So I would say that this is part of a scribal community, part of an education community, and part of the copying process that preserves many of the texts for us today.
Perfect. Thank you. And now, final question. Dr. Osiris is saying, I thought there used to be 13 zodiac signs.
Okay, I'm so glad you asked this question. This is a modern thing that happened. So, okay, the zodiac is that band in the sky that the ecliptic goes through, that the planets appear to go through, that the sun and moon appear to go through. Now, stars have shifted over time. Everything's moving in space. And even though it doesn't appear to be moving during a human lifetime, over millennia, things shift. And so not too long ago, like a decade or so, people were saying, well, actually, there's a 13th constellation that falls in that band. Ophiuchus, I think is the name of it, who's like a guy. It's not like an animal that's easy to talk about. Ophiuchus is just a Greek dude. So everyone said, well, let's add Ophiuchus into the zodiac and we'll add him to our modern sense of astrology today. Babylonians would have hated that because dividing something by 13 sucks mathematically, especially in a sexagesimal system. So they would not have wanted to add that 13th constellation. Again, they were always about making the math easier. And in that way, I too follow the Babylonians' lead for always choosing to make the math easy. I don't know if the modern astrological trends are still trying to keep that 13th constellation in the zodiac, but it's all about the way that the sky has shifted over time and all about still understanding astrology is linked to what constellations the planets are moving through in the sky. So in that sense, we're still tied to the Babylonians.
I think this is a great place to end. El, thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate you coming and answering everyone's questions, but especially my questions, because I had so many of them.
I'm happy to do it. If anyone has any further questions, you can reach out to me. My contact info is on the website, but I'd encourage you to come take the class too. I'll be easily approachable there for questions, and we'll go into much of this in more detail.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, audience. It's always a delight to see you all, and we will see you next time. Bye. Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.